participate online later, and if there's a problem, we'll deal with that at the moment. Welcome to meeting number 15 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Sorry, I forgot to gavel in. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.2 and the motion adopted on Wednesday, November 19th, 2025, the committee shall commence its study on the review of Budget 2025. I would like to welcome our witnesses. We have Mr. Jason Jakes, the Interim Parliamentary Budget Officer. We have Mark Mahabir, the Director General and General Counsel, Costing and Budgetary. We have Christine Grinchspoon, Director for Fiscal Analysis, Diara Surang, the Director Economic Analysis, and Caroline Nicole, the Advisor Analyst. So it looks like we've got a great lineup from the PBO today, and we will begin our round of questions with 6 minutes for Mr.
Introductory remarks.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. You get to do introductory remarks. I was jumping right in. You have 5 minutes for opening remarks, Mr. Jakes. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair, distinguished members of the committee. We appreciate the invitation to appear before you today to discuss our budget issues report. At
this point, witnesses typically read speaking points that repeat text from a report that you have already read. So instead, given this committee's role in reviewing fiscal policy, I'd like to take a few moments to discuss the concepts of fiscal sustainability.
Is the government's ability to maintain...
Sorry, Mr. Jakes, we're just waiting for a translation. 1 second. Okay, please continue. It looks like the translation is working. Go ahead.
Je peux le répéter.
Would you like me to repeat?
Sustainability is the government's ability to maintain its current spending, tax, and other policies over the long term without threatening government solvency. One clear indicator of fiscal sustainability is the declining debt-to-GDP ratio. This indicator is important because it compares the country's public debt to its economic output. A declining debt-to-GDP ratio means that the economy is growing faster than debt is accumulating, making it easier for the government to service its obligations without resorting to excessive borrowing or austerity. It also means that additional fiscal room is being created over time, so the government has fiscal firepower to deal with future challenges and risks while keeping the debt level below where it started. This approach guided federal fiscal policy from the mid-1990s until now. During that period, the federal debt-to-GDP ratio dropped from 66% to 41%. While it rose during recessions and the pandemic, it later declined. Budget 2025 revised the government's fiscal anchors, including cutting the debt-to-GDP anchor. Under the baseline scenario in Budget 2025, the federal debt ratio is projected to remain relatively stable over the next 30 years. Finance Canada projects that the federal debt-to-GDP ratio will rise to 43% in 2033-34 and then gradually decline to slightly below its 2024-2025 level. By this measure, the federal government is fiscally sustainable over a 30-year horizon. However, the fiscal room previously created to address future challenges and risks is now much smaller. The next time we face adverse shocks, the government will likely need to take on additional debt, increasing the debt-to-GDP ratio, perhaps to a permanently higher level. At present, the federal government has the ability to borrow additional funds to address emerging challenges. At the same time, I would note that this change to fiscal management occurred relatively quickly and without parliamentary deliberation. The Prime Minister confirmed the debt-to-GDP anchor was in place in September, and then it was abandoned 6 weeks later. Such fundamental shifts would benefit from greater transparency. As always, our office remains committed to its core mandate, providing independent and nonpartisan analysis to support Parliament in its scrutiny of public finances and the economy.
Consistent with the PBO's legislated mandate, my office prepared an independent analysis of Budget 2025. Our report highlights key issues, including the government's adoption of a new budgeting framework that separates operating expenses from capital investments and the introduction of new fiscal anchors. And now, we will be happy to answer your questions on the budget issues note. Thank you, Mr. Jakes.
Overlooking you for a moment there. We will begin now with 6 minutes for Mr. Halan.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Jakes, thanks for being here, and to your team for being so readily available for this committee. Mr. Jakes, you outlined in your report about Budget 2025 that $100 billion was misidentified under so-called investment, and that should have been operational expense. Why did you reclassify that $100 billion in your report?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit how we treated capital investment in our issues note. Essentially, we compared the approach of the government, that is a bit broader, that includes a greater type of measures, with an approach that more closely follows other jurisdiction and international standards, that strictly focuses on transaction that directly increase the capital stock, and, like I said, follows definitions from international organization, from the System of National Accounts, from the United Nations. So that kind of extra amount of money would correspond to categories that the government has added to the definition, which can include, tax measures, production subsidies, and others.
Thank you. Now, given that you've reclassified that $100 billion, what does that do to the fiscal anchor of the operational budget that they're saying that they're going to supposedly balance in 3 years?
Well, I think that, like, the one thing we highlighted in a report is that it would make it harder to balance the operating budget if the definition of capital was stricter.
Right. Now, for the people that are watching today, what does that say to the Canadians? Like, what is that, all the stuff that we're talking about right now, not meeting a fiscal anchor or risking it, what does that do to a Canadian's bottom line?
Thanks for the question. I think the bottom line, as we would see it, is it does come back to one of transparency. So whether it's the definition of capital, where the government has come up with a made in Ottawa definition of capital that bears some resemblance to what we've seen in the UK and other jurisdictions, but as we point out, is much broader, or the government is changing, making very substantial changes to fiscal anchors within a relatively short period of time, it really, Parliament and I think Canadians would potentially benefit from a more open and clearer discussion around it.
I fully agree with you. I think that, Mr. Jakes, you brought up the word transparency a lot, whether it's, as you said in your opening statement, that the government within 6 weeks changed its fiscal anchors and the broad definition of capital. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you would like to see that you're not seeing today under this government when it comes to transparency, and what does that say to credibility of this government?
Well, I think, excuse me, we offer one recommendation in the report, and specifically with respect to the definition of capital, that given that the government is now planning on using the operating budget or a balanced operating budget as one of the fiscal anchors, and the linkage between the operating budget and the capital definition, given that they're intrinsically linked, that the government, somebody else should be defining the definition of what capital actually looks like. I think the comparison that I've used in other situations is you need to have a separation of responsibility.
Il faut avoir une séparation des responsabilités. Donc, pour mon fils de 17 ans, ce n'est pas quelqu'un qui arrive avec ses devoirs. Il exécute ses devoirs, il fait ses devoirs. Et quelqu'un, après, va mettre une note. Et certainement, quand il est question de la cible capitale, Monsieur Jakes, on a un problème avec l'interprétation.
The French, this channel switched. Have we fixed it? Can we try it again? Can you carry on?
Sure.
Has it corrected
good.
itself?
Certainly from our perspective, looking at the previous fiscal anchors, the Government of Canada or the Department of Finance doesn't define debt. That's defined by the Public Sector Accounting Board. It doesn't define GDP. That's something defined by Statistics Canada. And now we moved into territory where the Department of Finance defines what capital is. And they come up with the capital budget, and then they will assess that after the fact and potentially make changes to what the definition of capital is as they see fit. And that's something that we recommend should be changed, consistent with what we see in the UK, where while the UK might have a capital definition, it's set by somebody else, and the assessment is also done by somebody else after the fact. It's simply good practice.
I agree. I think I really appreciate that you highlighted this transparency piece altogether. But I'd like to know from you, what does that do to our credibility when obviously if you're pointing out there's not much transparency, what does it do to Canada's credibility, or how would Canadians take a look at that when it comes to seeing like there's no transparency in the fiscal anchors, as you've highlighted before, or the fact that they've abandoned their debt to GDP ratio?
Well, I would say that by virtue of this committee meeting here today, for parliamentarians to be spending 2 hours on this issue and discussing and debating this issue, I think it certainly speaks to the credibility and confidence that Canadians can have that parliamentarians are paying attention to the issue. From our perspective, there are issues that we've raised that we think are pertinent to parliamentarians that potentially they might want to make changes to them. So, for instance, in the case of the UK and Australia, after an election, a government is legislatively required to actually identify in crystal clear language what the new fiscal anchors are and how they're going to be measured. So that's something that potentially parliamentarians might want to discuss and might see to be worthwhile.
Thank you, Mr. Jenks, and thank you, Mr. Halland. That concludes the time for this round. On va continuer avec Monsieur Letao.
We'll now continue with Mr. Letao. You have 6 minutes. You are on mute, Mr. Letao.
Est-ce que ça va maintenant?
Now, can you hear me? Yes? Yes, we can hear you. Thank you very much. My apologies. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. To Mr. Jakes, good morning, and your team, good morning. And thank you for being with us today. So I think we're going to have a very good conversation. We have good enough time for that. And it appears to me that there are 2 issues that I would like to raise with you, and if I do have time, perhaps we can speak more later. The first point is this. I'd like to talk about long-term sustainability. You mentioned that based on your analysis, the government of Canada is, in the long term, sustainable. Could you just confirm that that is the case? Yes, that is so. Thank you. So fiscally, we are sustainable. That is being maintained. And you also mentioned that one of the indicators that you were using to undertake your analysis was the debt to GDP ratio. But there are also other indicators. Could you perhaps share with us what those other indicators are that you use in order to reach your conclusions? Well, the debt to GDP ratio is the most important one. It's a long-term one. And I imagine, based on your experience, you would agree that there are other indicators that are more focused on the current year. For example, the ability of Canada to borrow money on financial markets. And that would be more of a focus on current activities. Thank you. And we have seen that following the announcement of the budget, financial markets didn't really move much. So the Government of Canada's capacity to finance its current activities remains intact. And in fact, as you also know, the financial markets are also forward-looking. And so if there had been any indication that that ability, that capacity to markets might be compromised, well, we would already see that in what would be happening on the financial markets, and that does not appear to be an issue. Now, what I wanted to say was this, and this is my second point, or rather second issue that I wanted to raise, deals with this, transparency. You spoke to transparency, and I think it's very important. In your own analysis, I believe that all the information that you required is there. There was nothing hidden. You know, when you look at the evolution of the debt and the deficit, first the deficit and then the debt, obviously, you have access to all the information you need. So we're not trying to necessarily hide what the deficit is, and no one is trying to do that. You know, the numbers for the deficit are very clearly spelled out. So I don't think that's an issue, is it? You mentioned the indicators that you were referring to. Yes, that is the case. However, I would say this. We are still waiting for responses from some departments regarding their increases in expenditures, for example, at defense. And there is a current discussion going on about the Government of Canada's plans to implement a $68 billion decrease over the next several years and the elimination of 40,000 positions. But we do not have enough details on this plan, and that is actually integral to Budget 2025 because, as you may imagine, the ability for the Government of Canada to be able to implement reductions of $68+ billion is intimately tied to Canada's ability to respect its fiscal anchors and to be able to balance a budget, basically. Yes, I absolutely agree with you. In fact, it is a very ambitious budget, this $60 billion worth of adjustments. Yes, it is an ambitious target, and we all agree on that. And you are right in terms of the details. We want to do this in a humane fashion and in a respectful fashion. We want to be respectful of our employees. We can come back to this. And, you know, there are many measures that can be used, for example, early retirement, etc. And we'll see how this unfolds. And we'll see what we need to do to be able to reach these goals. We'll have to see whether the measures give us the goals we want to reach. Thank you, Mr. Letao. That's your time, and we'll now continue with Mr. Garon. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. We truly appreciate your attendance. Now, we already had a beginning of a conversation about this. The government has probably really expanded its room and its the elasticity of the room that it has. On page 322, I see that perhaps Singapore has a similar approach. What I'd like to know is this. I'd like to know if elsewhere in the world, investments would be considered as the following. On page 229, it says to broaden, for example, early retirement at border services. Would you call that an investment anywhere else in the world? Just give me a yes or a no. Would that count as an investment? Well, we don't have any details right now. We could come back to the committee with that. Recruiting military personnel, is that an investment? FIFA, for example? Migrating software? We can get back to the committee on that. So could you send us answers in writing? Thank you very much. Perhaps what this is an indicator of is this very broad definition of capital. Because these examples aren't necessarily intuitively investments. So on page 229, when you say when it says recruiting military personnel, does that actually result in an accumulation of capital? And would that fit in with the internationally recognized standards? Well, I think it would be very difficult to account for that. I understand. I did consult accountants and auditors. And if you're going to include these in, for example, a balance, well, it wouldn't work anywhere else. Now, I'd like to talk about infrastructure. The Minister of Finance has claimed in the media that $115 billion will be new money in infrastructure. Provinces were asking about $100 billion over 10 years. But based on our math, if we look at the new money, not the money that already existed, if you look at the new money, over 5 years, there's actually only $9 billion in infrastructure, including the $5 billion to build hospitals. And the government of Quebec estimates that $22 billion this is 22 over 10 years. So how much money is there actually for infrastructure? We received an answer from the Minister of Finance on that issue. But unfortunately, the response from the department regarding infrastructure is confidential. And so I cannot share the details with you. Well, just more or less. Can you give us an idea? Well, it's not high. That's all I can say. So you mean we're pretty far off from that $115 billion. So are we close? Is our math pretty close? Well, my lawyer is right here. And I believe I have to respect the confidentiality of the Department of Finance. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think what this is showing is that the Minister of Finance, as usual, is going around to the various television channels and making very exaggerated claims. We've looked at the numbers, and we feel that we're tens of billions of dollars off. Now, since we have this new Prime Minister, and speaking of transparency, is it difficult to get information from the Department of Finance? How are things going between the PBO and the Finance Department? You know, when it comes to getting information, I think everything's fine with the Department of Finance. There are other departments where it's more difficult to get information. But it's good. Things are good with the Department of Finance. Well, good then. Now, the government has implemented this super productivity deduction. And they say it actually looks like it's a very small amount of money, $1.49 billion over 5 years. And the government has been going around saying that this is a super deduction. The minister says that this will generate all kinds of investment. And yet, there's a much more aggressive approach in the United States. So if you look at this super deduction, which is actually just a regular deduction, would you agree that it's going to attract all kinds of investment? And would you say that the government is being perhaps a little bit too optimistic? Unfortunately, at this stage, we're not necessarily able to look at the investment that this will generate. Now, in terms of optimism, well, when you're talking about productivity, you're talking about an optimal use of capital and labor. And so this will all depend on whether businesses are participating in this program or not, or whether their participation is increasing. Well, as an economist, can one conclude or agree that $1.5 billion over 5 years is not going to lead to trillions of dollars in investments?
Je vous enverrai à nos multiplicateurs.
Well, I can send you our notes. That will give you a pretty good idea of the amount of GDP that would be generated thanks to the initiatives.
Please.
Mr. Jacques, in your report, you call for an independent expert body to review or opine on what the government is including in the definition of capital investments. It is surprising, it is shocking that we need an independent body to sort of police the numbers. Can you explain why you felt that we needed this independent expert body?
It goes back to the fundamental principle of separation of responsibilities, which is an accounting concept. And fundamentally, you want to ensure that the people coming up with the budget and then evaluating whether they met the target, that those individuals don't have control over the definitions. So at the midpoint, they can't change the definitions of what falls into those categories.
But apart from a good practice, if the definitions had not been changed and made so broadly and the presentation of the budget had been changed, we wouldn't necessarily be calling for an independent expert body. This is as a result of the changes, of the layers of difficulty that we have in actually understanding what counts as an operating expense and what counts as a capital expense. Is that fair to say?
I would say that is fair, and if this was not related to the government's new fiscal anchor of balancing the operating budget, it would be interesting that the Government of Canada came up and is now defining capital differently than the Accounting Board and Statistics Canada and the United Nations. But it's something that the government could do. They can come up with any language they want to and define things as they see fit. That's their discretion. The moment it entered into the territory of this is our new fiscal anchor and this is how Canadians can judge our performance and this is how we're going to be communicating with parliamentarians, it turned it into an issue, or it turned it into something that certainly requires greater transparency and better controls so parliamentarians can understand it, know what they're looking at, and deliberate over it.
Yeah, I mean, when I read through the budget, I did find that it was very vague. It was not clear what was included as a capital investment and what was excluded from it. I think that the government was intentional in the vagueness, and as a finance professional, I felt that was surprising because it's such an important term, and you would expect it to be actually clearly laid out. So would you say that having an independent expert who determines what counts as capital investments will allow parliamentarians to make more informed decisions when it comes to reporting and scrutinizing the government's expenses?
The short answer is yes, and the longer answer, which you probably don't want, is looking at how changes actually happen to Public Service Accounting Board standards. There is a draft discussion paper that's published months, if not years in advance. It's circulated for comments. Those comments are then collated by the Accounting Standards Board. Then there's a revised draft that is issued for potentially further consultation if there isn't tight consensus. And ultimately, the new standard is implemented with a bit of lead time so everyone can react to it. Certainly in this situation, that's something that could be a good practice, and especially were there to be a change in government or change in Minister of Finance, certainly having transparency around how that Minister of Finance defines capital, it would certainly be something that would be potentially challenging for parliamentarians if there were there to be a new Minister of Finance and the definition was changing without consultation or any of the information being published.
When I speak to my constituents, a lot of them are saying, well, we just want accountability, and they actually welcome this recommendation of an independent expert body so that they feel that the numbers are a little bit more reliable. You sort of take politics out of the numbers. So it was actually welcome based on your report. Have you received any confirmation or assurances from the Prime Minister or the Minister of Finance that they will be adopting this recommendation of an independent expert body?
No.
Thank you. Would you say that this expanded definition of capital investments present the government's fiscal position in a better situation than it actually is?
I would say that it's additional and new information. all of the old information is still there. So debt levels, debt to GDP, deficit to GDP, all those data still exist. The observation that
Thank you, Mr. Jakes. We're going to have to end this round there. Thank you, Ms. Kobina. We're going to continue with Mr. Sawatsky for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll actually be passing it to Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks. Okay, great. So thanks for being here. I assume you've read, Mr. Jacques, the Annex 2 of the budget, which is capital budgeting framework? Okay, great. So it clearly outlines definitions and categories. So I'm not sure that the criticism is very fair that it doesn't clearly identify how the government is intending to define capital investment. Would you agree with that? That it actually does define it, even if you disagree with the definitions? It goes to lengths to create a transparent set of definitions, does it not?
what I would say is that that information is contained within the annex, based upon the questions that we were asked earlier. The linkage with some measures in terms of the their capital nature is a bit strained, a bit stretched, which makes it challenging, as a professional who is familiar with, who is a professional accountant, who has over 20 years of worth of experience dealing with the Statistics Canada system of national accounts. It makes it very challenging for someone like me to quickly respond and intuitively understand what is in those categories.
And I understand that, but it does define capital investment, correct? I mean, just a clear answer, it defines it. I mean, you may disagree with it, and I'm getting to that in a second, but I'm just checking. Like, it actually goes to lengths to define what a capital investment is in this budget for this government, does it not? Yeah. Okay, good. So, and then you're saying that you're taking issue, it sounds to me like the heart of the issue is you're taking issue with the definition of capital investment, saying that perhaps tax exemptions or deductions that are used by many governments, including ours, to spur investment or to attract capital expenditure in certain categories should not be included as a capital investment. Is that your position?
I think the position is, again, on that issue with respect to what is included and what is not included, we're not offering recommendations. Where we're offering recommendations is around the definition itself. So there's currently a process established by the Government of Canada around their new fiscal anchor where they set the definitions around operating and capital, which are distinct from clear independent definitions that are already set for operating and capital.
I understand.
And our recommendation is that similar to those other definitions, and I should say similar to what the Department of Finance and the government has done for about the past 30 years around their economic forecast, where they don't produce their own economic forecast. It's based upon an independent arm's length survey. Our recommendation is that the government or parliamentarians may wish to consider going in a similar direction.
So I hear that recommendation.
Yeah, so
You've mentioned
that's the only
it
recommendation.
multiple times. I'm not trying to cut you off, but I want to ask more questions. So, but is your position that to say that those tax exemptions or deductions do not contribute to capital formation? Because I don't think that that's exactly what you're saying, but I want to clarify that you're not, if you are saying that, then tell me. If you're not saying that, I just want a simple yes or no. So are you saying that tax exemptions and deductions do not contribute to capital formation in the economy?
No.
Okay, great. Thank you. I will say, are there other countries in the world that include R&D tax incentives and other forms of clean economy tax incentives and deductions for, immediate expensing, et cetera, as capital, as part of their capital budgeting frameworks?
There might be.
Okay, so I have a list.
In the case of what we're most familiar with and what the government has pushed on is the case of the UK. And in the case of the UK, they would not be included.
Okay, so let me read a list of ones that I researched ahead of this meeting. So I asked what countries include tax incentives in their capital budgeting framework, and I got Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, United States, Belgium, Finland, France, Germany, Ireland, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, United Kingdom, China, Hong Kong, India, Israel, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, United Arab Emirates, Australia, New Zealand, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, and South Africa. Now, I don't have the time to research that at length, but I did a quick search and found that there are many jurisdictions around the world that include tax incentives and deductions for things that we heard from the Deputy Bank of Canada Governor would actually boost investment in our economy and hopefully help with our productivity challenges, which I'm sure you would agree are a good thing. We're including those as part of the capital budgeting framework, which is not that unheard of. I mean, you seem to have made some of these definitions almost sound as if the government is taking this broad latitude that I don't think it's taking.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. On va continuer avec Monsieur Garand pour 2 minutes et demie.
Mr. Garand, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. Actually, I'd like my colleague to be able to table the sources of what he was speaking to, because I received the same answer from GPT. Now, the government has said in order to achieve its deficit targets, it will have to cut $68 billion in spending over 5 years, $10 billion for the first year. Now, Canada has not always met its targets, and based on my understanding, you're still lacking information that you need on what will be cut so that we do achieve these targets. Based on the information you have today, are you concerned that Canada will not meet its $68 billion target for by next year? In our report, we said that we pointed out what it will have to do on a yearly basis in order to be able to achieve that ratio, and that the likelihood of it reaching that target, it won't. So you said there's something like a 7% probability that it will achieve its target. So what information is it that you're lacking? Because when we asked officials, when the budget was tabled, we were told that they were giving examples, but in fact, it appeared to us that they were not actually fully informed about how it was going to cut. So it seems like still today, they don't know what they're going to cut in order to be able to make these reductions by $800 million a month. Well, we need information on what programs will be cut, on the number of people that will be cut per program, what the impact will be on services, and where the money will be cut exactly. That information is absolutely essential so that we can get an idea of what the probability is that we'll reach its target. I believe I have 20 seconds left. Could you please name another OECD country that uses debt to GDP ratio for this purpose? I can't tell you now. If you give me a few minutes and a few hours, then perhaps I could give you more details. We'll continue with Mr. Lefebvre for the next 5 minutes. Thank you, and welcome. Mr. Jacques, I'd like you to take more time to respond to Mr. Turnbull's question. Well, we have had several discussions with experts. I don't think there's much to add. Several experts who have worked for the UK, and that's why we are so confident in our recommendations and in our analysis. And it's very surprising to me that we have completely different information being used. I am a humble man. I am very open. I'm very open to using the data that it's out there, but it appears to me that there is some rather contradictory information between, say, us and the UK, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility. There are other people who manage public accounts in the UK. I think it would be very interesting if the committee were to share its information and all its information with us. Well, we'll put that request in then. Now, you spoke about the government's definition for capital, and you said they're way too broad. You pointed out that expenditures should not be counted as capital expenditures. So For example, there are tax deductions for corporations. Do you feel that should be part of investments? Well, based on the Government of Canada's opinion, that is what's happening. What about the investment tax credit? Well, it falls under the Government of Canada's definition. Now, Fitch noted that, made a comment about the erosion of Government of Canada finances. Do you agree with this? Well, I don't work with credit rating, but I believe this all harks back to transparency. In other words, all data has to be shared with us, regardless of what it is, so that we can reach our conclusions. Are you concerned that credit rating agencies are thinking of decreasing Canada's ranking? Well, our recommendation is to increase transparency, specifically because of this. Because it's up to the Government of Canada to make decisions, budget decisions, and how to measure them. And there are other people also who need to be able to make decisions when it comes to investments here. And so that's why we think transparency should be as high as possible, so that there is a justification that's being provided for decisions such as changing the definition of a fiscal anchor in such a short period of time. And we also need to be able to make sure that our credibility is as high as it can be, especially when it comes to capital investments, because as I already said, there have already been other examples here in Canada regarding the definition of capital. And here we have something absolutely new, again, that has been defined here in Ottawa. Thank you. Now, from the very beginning, you've been talking about transparency and credibility. And you said that the Prime Minister confirmed that he would keep this ratio to GDP, debt to GDP ratio as an anchor. And the Liberal government actually has abandoned its fiscal anchor that it first announced. Why is it so important for Canada to keep this debt to GDP ratio as an anchor? Well, thank you for the question. This is a fiscal anchor that was implemented more than 30 years ago. And when you look at other countries in the world, and also credit rating agencies, it's a very important anchor. It's not up to us to decide which anchors the government wants to implement or use. But at the same time, for the purposes of transparency, when there is such a quick change with no in-depth discussion that involves Parliament, well, then it reduces that quality of transparency. And it could create a perception as well that that these numbers are political. Thank you. That wraps up the time that you have, Mr. Lefebvre, and we'll continue now with Mr. Sawatsky for 5 minutes.
And thank you to the witnesses for coming here today. I just wanted to ask about the IMF recently praised Canada's decisive action to modernize its budget framework, including splitting the capital and operating spending, for which we've been talking about. They said both Germany and Canada recognize that in this very testing time, they need to use their fiscal space. And one of these actions is indeed to modernize the budget framework by separating operating expenses in the budget from investments. That ability to then focus strategically on investments that are pro-growth and that can lift up productivity. So I just wanted to ask as well, so does your analysis reflect the benefits of that reform? I know you had touched on some of the specifics, but kind of in a broad sense, do you see this to be something that could be beneficial? Great. And so I guess maybe if you could dive a bit more into the specifics. I know you mentioned there was perhaps like a few things that you might have wanted to see differently. Maybe if you could just elaborate.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Again, in terms of this split between operating and capital, that's something that the government has done internally, which is certainly their right to do so. And I think it's certainly good that the government, because they've changed their internal decision-making processes around operating and capital, if that's how you're managing internally, I think it's very transparent to share that information with the public, to explain how you're making decisions and what one wants to accomplish. In terms of the observations we make around a broad capital definition term, it's broad in comparison to other jurisdictions. So there are things included in the definition that typically one would not include in other jurisdictions. And that's something that parliamentarians should be aware of. Certainly the government's aware of it, because the further you stretch the relationship between the investment or the spending and what is considered an investment, the harder it is to actually identify or determine whether it's actually a capital investment or not. It's not to say that tax expenditures would not somehow indirectly benefit capital investment. It's simply to say that it becomes harder to actually draw a clear linkage between the two.
Thank you. And when we're talking about investments, capital expenditures, what would be some things that you see, as clearly capital investments into the country?
Well, I think we'd start with the definition from the System of National Accounts. So starting with the definition from Statistics Canada. So they have a definition with respect to what capital is. I believe on a monthly basis they're publishing something called capital investment and capital formation in the economy. So that would certainly be a starting point. If you wanted to extend it a little bit further, being an accountant, I would extend it further to include and incorporate the Public Sector Accounting Board standards. So there are some things included in the Public Sector Accounting Board standards which might not necessarily show up within the System of National Accounts, but it's a larger concentric circle, and so you might include some of those things as well. To the best of my knowledge, to use an example, an operating subsidy from the federal government to a private sector firm to produce something on an ongoing basis, within the first two categories, so from Statistics Canada and the Public Sector Accounting Board standard, that would not be considered a capital investment and wouldn't show up in your balance sheet. It's not to say the government can't define it as such. It is to say, and the observation we make is, if you're coming up with a new definition, if one wants to use a new definition of what capital is, it's important to be transparent around it so all parliamentarians understand. And also when it's linked to, clearly intrinsically linked to the new operating budget anchor, budgetary anchor of the government, it probably will increase the transparency and credibility if the definition you're using is not one that you come up with on your own and you don't have full control over, and it's not subject to change as you see fit.
Thank you. And so that makes sense. So Budget 2025 makes some productivity focused investments, such as housing, defense, major projects, and the Build Community Strong Fund, which is $51 billion over 10 years, and then an ongoing $3 billion per year thereafter. So when your office assesses long-term fiscal sustainability, how do you incorporate these expected long-term returns from these investments into housing, infrastructure, defense?
Sorry, Mr. Swatsky, we're going to have to end it there. Okay, that concludes the time for this round. Mr. Kelly for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'd like to continue on the topic of credibility. You mentioned in your opening statement that it was only 6 weeks ago that the Prime Minister was insisting that his government's fiscal anchor was a declining debt to GDP ratio, and now it is a declining deficit to GDP ratio, wherein they then change the definition of an operating deficit and claim that that is a new fiscal anchor. Can you talk about how changing the goalposts, cutting loose fiscal anchors, and these kinds of inconsistencies affect Canada's fiscal credibility?
Thanks for the question. I would say again it comes back to an issue of the government has full discretion to establish whatever fiscal management practices it wants to, including identifying or potentially changing the fiscal anchors as it sees fit. from our perspective, and looking at good practices across among advanced economies, if you're going to do so, you should do it in a transparent way that brings everyone along with you. So if there are fundamental changes that the government has planned with respect to fiscal management, a good practice would be to explain, these are the changes we're proposing. Does anyone have any feedback? Does everyone understand what these are and what the consequences might be? And then after receiving feedback, potentially putting those into place, incorporating the feedback as you see fit. And that's something that, again, we flag for parliamentarians.
So when an existing fiscal anchor like a declining debt to GDP ratio is so quickly abandoned, how much credibility does the new fiscal anchor have?
I don't know that I'm in a good position to judge that using numbers.
Well, okay. Now, with numbers, you did note in your report that there is only, in your estimation, only a 7.5% chance that the government will maintain the anchor that it is now assigned itself. So, talk about that, how you arrived at that conclusion, and how that impacts the credibility of the government.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in terms of measuring the probability of the government respecting its declining deficit to GDP anchor, that's based upon, it's actually using an IMF framework and looking at the historical shocks that have faced the Canadian economy going back over the past 30 years. And when we face those shocks, how severe are they, and in that context, is the government going to be able to still respect those anchors? And again, it's not to say that they can't, and going back to the question around fiscal sustainability, it's not to say that the government is not fiscally sustainable. It is to say that there's a lot less room than there used to be. And the next time there's an economic shock, and there will be, and economic shocks mean recessions, economic shocks can mean pandemics, economic shocks can mean the terrorist attacks of 2001. When those shocks happen, there's far less space, fiscal space, than we had previously.
Right, so they are setting themselves up to have less room to deal with events which we know will happen in the years ahead.
That's correct.
Right. So if a fiscal anchor has only a 7.5% chance of being maintained, is there any purpose in stating an anchor?
I think that's a better question for the Minister of Finance rather than myself.
Right. So there's a 92. Your assessment is there's a 92.5% chance that this government will not maintain this anchor.
That's correct.
Right. So that would, I think, leave one to conclude that there's really not much point, especially since they just cut loose their last anchor when it seemed unlikely that, in fact, even their own budget says they will not meet their last anchor. Maybe last question then. So when the finance department decided on its own to change the definition in order to create to then give itself this new anchor with almost no chance of being maintained, they were actually violating the accounting principle of separation of responsibility.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We're going to have to end it there. We'll continue with Mr. McDonald for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witness for attending today. Mr. Jakes, all our forecasting, or what you would be doing and your team, they're a moment-in-time analysis, I would take it, because in my previous career running a business, that's all you can use is a moment in time. Now, there's many fiscal risks that we have faced in the last year, 12 months or less. But a lot of these recent developments that we've also seen in major trade agreements around the world since our Prime Minister took office, and global capital attraction. In particular, on the weekend, we heard about a $70 billion deal with the UAE. How do these things fit into, they wouldn't have fit into your initial analysis of the budget, but obviously they're going to affect our ability to pay down debt and realize more returns. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Thanks for the question. The short answer is yes. It will definitely have some sort of effect on growth and our ability to pay down debt. The longer answer is we're constantly updating our economic modeling. So of the 4 colleagues you see at the table, there's another 35 colleagues back in the office at this point, some of the smartest economists in Canada, who are constantly monitoring external and international economic developments, as well as domestic developments and additional policy decisions made by the Government of Canada. And when we publish our updated fiscal and economic outlook sometime in the spring, all of that will be reflected.
But you understand where I'm coming from. I mean, growth is very slow in Canada, and it's a result of negative shocks from tariffs and situations like that. The opposition's been speaking a lot about transparency today, and one of your predecessors, Kevin Page, said, and I'll quote him, "The separation of operating and capital spending is a reporting change, not an accounting change, and it increases transparency on capital investment. The hard target of a balanced operating budget in 28-29 will put more constraints on the government than would fiscal rules tied to changes in the size of the economy, such as declining debt to GDP ratio." Can you comment on that?
I didn't see Mr. Page's analysis.
Okay, thank you. In Budget 2025, we see major measures to attract new private sector investment. Could you outline how increased private capital inflows typically affect the fiscal outlook and how they can reduce pressure on government's borrowing needs over the long term?
So typically when we see investment increase, it reflects directly into nominal GDP, which then speaks, as we say usually, it's one of the largest proxy of the government's tax base, which then eventually translates into corporate tax revenues, but also personal income tax revenues, because more people are employed and wages are growing, but also consumption is growing as well, so more GST revenues.
Thank you. Just one more question. On regional development effects, since I represent Atlantic Canada with a lot of fisheries and agriculture, trade expansion and capital attraction, how does that benefit the rural areas? Because we're export dominant. We're dependent on exports.
I would go back to the comments that my colleague DR just offered with respect to additional trade and additional economic development and economic linkages. To the extent that it's easier for somebody to take their products, high quality Canadian products, and where there's a trade agreement negotiated with another country, export those products in an easy way, obviously that company, but also that region ends up being further ahead. And certainly if you're looking at the east end of PEI, there are, beyond beautiful beaches and great dairy products, there are people producing things for export, and a lot of good light manufacturing at that end of the island that potentially would benefit from additional trade agreements.
Maybe I have time for one more question. So when you guys do your analysis, what outcome indicators should we be watching most closely to measure the success of Budget 2025 in the future? So a year or two down the road, is there a trade or investment strategy?
Sorry, Mr. McDonald, that concludes your time.
I guess I don't get that question.
You got the question, just not the answer yet. Okay, thank you. On va continuer avec M. Garand pour 2 minutes et demie.
2.5 minutes for Mr. Garand. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to continue with fiscal anchors. The government decided unilaterally this year, with a few weeks' notice, that the new anchor would be that the deficit to GDP had to be a declining one. So if we're going to use that as a fiscal anchor, would it not be that we want there to be a ceiling on that deficit to GDP ratio in order to ensure that we'll have a declining debt to GDP ratio? Because right now there's no guarantee at all. Even if the debt to GDP goes down, or rather deficit to GDP goes down, there's no guarantee that the debt to GDP won't continue to rise. I mean, isn't this just a way of camouflaging the fact that the debt to GDP ratio is actually going to increase, and so they had to make up a fiscal anchor to somehow camouflage that? Well, mathematically, I agree on the deficit to GDP ratio versus the debt to GDP ratio. However, I'm not in a position to judge, to sort of pass judgment on what the reasons would have been for changing these fiscal anchors. Another quick question then. The government says that it's going to reduce the size of the public service by 40,000 positions. And so in the implementation legislation, all penalties will be removed for early retirement. Now, of course, that will have an effect. Can you tell us what the impact will be on Canada's debt if we allow people to retire early with no penalty? Well, obviously, there's a cost to that, and it's indicated in the budget. And where there is a cost, obviously, that cost is part of the deficit, and obviously that will increase the debt. So in order to reduce the public service with no penalty, and having these employees leave early without having fully contributed to their pension, then over the years, the average taxpayer will continue to pay for that. Well, we're talking about the public pension, yes, and there is a cost to that. Thank you. We're going to have to finish with your question.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Jakes, you identified in your report that the government only has a 7.5% chance of meeting one of their own fiscal targets of a declining deficit to GDP ratio. If they don't meet that ratio, what are the consequences? Like, what happens?
It goes back to, in terms of the consequences, it goes back to potentially questions. It raises questions regarding whether the government, in terms of the government's overall fiscal management strategy. So to the extent to which one has a plan, there are targets within that plan, and those targets aren't being met, it raises the question whether it's the right plan or potentially there needs to be a change in the overall execution. So some of the indicators beyond that specific target in terms of the fiscal anchor, some of the other indicators are obviously the 1 trillion number, so the substantial planned increase in investment within the Canadian economy, as well as a doubling of trade outside of the United States. So those are some other indicators as well.
Would that, suppose they don't meet that target, and would that shake investor confidence, in your opinion?
I don't think I'm well placed to hazard an opinion with respect to the response of financial markets should the government not achieve or meet their fiscal anchors.
Okay, it's fair. You know, when we talk, or when you rightfully said they changed the fiscal anchor after, what, like 30 years from debt to GDP to deficit to GDP. If this government had kept the debt to GDP ratio, do you think their chances to meet that target about it declining would be lower?
Had they decided to, and I always need to be, I won't answer a hypothetical question. That said, mathematically, had they kept it, they would have needed to potentially make different decisions within the budget. Because as we see within the government's own forecast, looking out over the next 10 years, the debt to GDP ratio is increasing. So over a 30-year horizon, it's effectively flat. The previous government had, and previous governments, had a declining debt to GDP ratio over a 5-year horizon. And had the government decided that they wanted to maintain that fiscal anchor, potentially different decisions would have needed to be taken as part of the budget.
The governor of the Bank of Canada was here, and once again, they raised the alarm bells on our productivity and its tie-in with the standards of living and how they're going down for Canadians. I just would like to get your thoughts on what declining in productivity and subsequently the standard of living, what does that mean for Canadians, in your opinion?
Thanks for the question. The productivity is one of the key inputs, both within our medium-term economic forecast, but also as part of our longer-term economic forecast as part of fiscal sustainability. And fiscal sustainability is a lot easier to achieve with a higher productivity rate, higher productivity growth.
Is our productivity a concern to you, though?
Productivity, a comparison to productivity, when you look at it over the past 40 years within Canada, has been declining over time. So it's something that's rightfully seized the attention of both parliamentarians and economists.
This current fiscal situation, what are your thoughts on the current unemployment rate and the youth unemployment rate?
It's certainly something that we pay attention to every month when the labor force statistics are released, and it's certainly something. And again, going back to a question of productivity and also just output within the economy, when there are over 400,000 people between the ages of 15 and 24 who are looking for full-time jobs right now and are searching for them and can't find them, that's a lot of untapped potential across the economy that could potentially boost growth and improve productivity.
What does that say about our current state of our economy?
Well, I think I didn't watch the governor here, but I'm sure going back to a point the governor probably mentioned is there's slack in the economy right now.
Right.
And that slack in the economy, it's a euphemism, but again, you drill down, it gets down to those 400,000 kids between the ages of 15 and 24 who are looking for full-time work who can't find it.
Right. Just a quick question about our GDP per capita. What are your thoughts on it?
Thank you, Mr. Hallan. We're going to have to end there. Thank you, Mr. Jakes. We'll go to Mr. Turnbull for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. So picking up where I left off, I wanted to actually switch tracks a little bit and ask you about the net debt to GDP ratio. Who has the lowest net debt to GDP ratio in the G7?
Within the G7, that would be Canada, I believe.
Yeah, at 13.3%. And the second lowest is Germany. Do you know what level Germany is at?
Off the top of my head, I do not.
So it's in the budget on page 6, 48.7, while Canada's at 13.3. So Canada's significantly better in terms of net debt to GDP ratio than all the G7, including Germany. We also have, I believe, one of the lowest deficit to GDP ratios in the G7. You aware of that?
I am.
Do you know that Germany's is higher than Canada's?
I am.
Yeah, and Germany and Canada both, as you know, have AAA credit ratings, right? So what I'm leaning towards here is, do you think Germany is also at risk of a downgrade in terms of credit rating? Like, do you think that they actually have that risk, or do you think Canada and Germany are at a good standard? Because Kevin Page recently said he was very, very comfortable with Canada being at around 2.2 to 2.5%, which is right in the range that Germany and Canada are at in terms of deficit to GDP ratios. Can you comment on that?
Sure. I didn't see see the work that Kevin did.
So Kevin just said he's very comfortable with Canada, implying that it's not necessarily. I know opposition members have referenced Fitch ratings as, as evidence that they think that Canada is going to be downgraded in some ways for our credit rating, but I don't think there's any risk of that. Do you think there's any risk of that in the current context?
Sorry, thanks for the question. I don't work for one of the ratings agencies. I might look like I do, but I don't. And hence, because I don't do the analysis of the ratings agencies, I'm not well placed to determine how the ratings agencies would assess Canada's debt now or in the past or in the future.
Okay, and just to be clear, you've mentioned transparency and credibility, accountability a number of times in this committee. I think it's been an ongoing theme, which I think is good that parliamentarians are having these debates. I assume you believe that the Finance Committee has a very important role to play in promoting transparency and having those debates and dialogues?
I believe in parliamentary democracy. It's why I've chosen my job.
Does that include studying the Budget Implementation Act, do you think?
I think it's a question of studying all the legislation and the policies before government. And again, going back to the issue of the one recommendation we did offer in this report, it's around studying when there are substantial changes made with respect to the fiscal anchors of the government within a relatively short period of time, and long-standing fiscal anchors. That's something which parliamentarians may wish to consider. We would recommend they should probably take a look at.
Thank you. So you agree that we should study the Budget Implementation Act and have these debates then?
I think obviously parliamentarians, one of the fundamental responsibilities of parliamentarians is to evaluate proposals from the government with respect to spending money. I think it was decided in 1215 with King John that no money could be spent without the approval.
So thank you for that. I'm going to move the following motion. Given the recent passage of Budget 2025, which will catalyze generational investments in the Canadian economy to create lasting prosperity, protect our communities,
Sorry, Mr. Turnbull,
and
there's a
empower...
point of order. No.
I will merely be catching your eye to speak to the motion
Oh.
once it's made.
Sorry, Mr. Turnbull.
Do you want me to start from the beginning?
Yes, please.
Okay. I want to move the following motion. Given the recent passage of Budget 2025, which will catalyze generational investments in the Canadian economy to create lasting prosperity, protect our communities, and empower Canadians, the tabling of the Budget Implementation Act 2025 and the scheduled upcoming appearance of the Parliamentary Budget Officer as part of the BIA pre-study, the committee immediately commence a subject matter study of said legislation, and that the committee invite the Minister of Finance, relevant officials, and expert witnesses to conduct a detailed examination of this important legislation. So, Madam Chair, I'd like to just speak to that, but we can, all parties should have that in both official languages because I put it on notice on Friday. So I would like to speak, and Mr. Jacques has been very generous with his time today, and I know has appeared in this committee multiple times in the last, I guess, 4 or 5 weeks, which is great to have him and his expertise. I think that we had agreed in our last meeting that his testimony should actually be included as part of the BIA study. And what I'm proposing here is to commence that study of the Budget Implementation Act. I know members opposite wanted to ensure that they had the language of that Budget Implementation Act before we started the study. That 604-page document has been tabled in Parliament. I'm sure members opposite have had the chance to dig in over the weekend. I know that there's lots of work to do on that. I think it's important work that we have to do. I think the debate but also the witness testimony that we can get on the record here in our committee is really imperative for us to be able to evaluate the Budget Implementation Act together, to work together on it. The House, fortunately, we're not going to a Christmas election, and I think the members that voted in favor of the budget, it passed the House, and with the majority of members, it's certainly great to see the support, but it also means, to me, it indicates that the will of Parliament, has shown and demonstrated that there's a majority of members of the House of Commons that support the budget, and I think Canadians rightfully would expect us to dig in to that work. I've had the chance to really pore over the BIA. There's lots and lots of measures. I know Mr. Garon was very concerned, as were we all, when we heard in previous deliberations in this committee that certain members of the disability community might be adversely impacted by a tax cut that the government had proposed. Well, the fix for that is in the BIA. And I think, we heard the minister come before this committee. I can't imagine that the Bloc members would not want that to be deliberated in this committee, would not want a solution to that to be sought. And I think, we should take the time we need. I know members opposite also said earlier. I forget what meeting it was, but it was fairly early on when this committee came back after the summer. In the fall, we started our deliberations on C4, which was the affordability measures that the government had put forward. But I remember members opposite talking about how they would have wanted more time for consultation and to have witnesses from their jurisdictions, from their ridings, be able to come to committee and give us their perspective. I think in terms of a BIA, we received 940 pre-budget consultation submissions. We tens of thousands of survey responses. So we did a what I would consider a very comprehensive consultation process, which was involved stakeholders across the country, but involved a lot of listening and a lot of taking that feedback and integrating it into the budget. And I think the budget reflects that input, but more so, I think we need to ensure that this committee, and we heard this today, quite frankly, I think it was a good theme out of today, just how important this committee is in terms of creating a forum for democracy and debate on key financial measures and issues, but also in terms of budgeting, what the government is proposing. And I know that I wrote it down on a piece of paper here. Mr. Jacques had said the government's job is to make budget decisions and decide how to measure. I think that was the direct quote. I hope I'm not misquoting him, but I believe that's what he said in response to Mr. Lefebvre's comments. And I took that, I think it's true. That is the government's job, but the Parliament has an important job and role to play as well. We are privileged to sit on the Finance Committee, but it also means we have a responsibility to Canadians. We have a responsibility to both scrutinize the BIA. I know members opposite in past have produced many potential amendments, and it was quite a rigorous process that we went through. I know I was here because it was clause by clause, and hearing from witnesses took many hours of our time. We extended our meetings to go, in many cases, right till midnight, and we turned up the pressure on ourselves in order to complete those things on a timeline that was beneficial for Canadians. So we really saw some urgency in getting budget measures out the door. And I think that that's the same urgency we should see in this committee. Now, I know the Conservative members wanted to study tax havens, and we did quite a number of meetings on that topic. I know the Bloc had proposed to have the Parliamentary Budget Officer appear, and we eventually agreed with that. Initially, we were a little skeptical because we had already had the interim PBO here about a month ago. But, we were reasonable, and I think I haven't sensed the sense of urgency around studying the BIA from opposition members, and I really think that it's really incumbent upon all of us as members of Parliament to get into the BIA now that it's been tabled in the House. We have the ability to scrutinize it. I'm sure members opposite will have cause for criticism and areas that they're concerned about or that they want more testimony on from stakeholders that they would like to push in this or that direction, to go further, and I think that debate is really important. I believe in a parliamentary democracy. I think that process has been very constructive and fruitful in the past, and I think we should get on with that work. So that's really what I'm proposing in this motion. It's to ensure that we get down to work on the BIA and that we consider Mr. Jacques and his team's testimony today as part of that study so that we can incorporate some of that, both critical lens, but also fair, testimony that, I think expert testimony that can be incorporated in. And we should hear from other witnesses too. on the various topics that we've covered today. So I think, there's lots in the BIA. I could really spend a lot of time. I could spend a lot of time talking about the BIA because I'm quite excited about it. In particular, I'll just mention a couple of things quickly. I'm really excited about the immediate expensing and the amendments to the SHRED program and the clean economy investment tax credits, which are being altered. And the reason I get excited about those, and this goes to the conversation we've been having today about a capital budgeting framework, I actually think that those measures respond to the lagging or stagnant productivity in Canada, and I think that they will spur investment in our economy, which is greatly needed to enhance growth, enhance productivity. When a company can invest in new machinery and equipment or protect its intellectual property or take money that they've been putting aside to pay their taxes at the end of the year and invest directly into productivity enhancing equipment and other activities that will enhance their productivity. I think that's a good thing for our economy. I think that's what we heard from the Bank of Canada governor. It's what we heard from the Deputy Bank of Canada governor when they were here, and they confirmed that those things would spur investment and likely contribute significantly to capital formation. And although we may have some difference of opinion, I think that there's many jurisdictions around the world, quite frankly, that see tax incentives or tax credits as ways of stimulating capital formation, and they do include that, as I understand, in their capital budgeting framework. So I don't think that is that unusual. But again, there's lots of other experienced experts that we could have come and tell us about how they do it as part of a study on the BIA. So I think, I really would like to see us move forward. I'm willing to work with members opposite to see a path forward on studying the BIA, ensuring that all parties, of course, get to submit witnesses and that we have an adequate number of meetings dedicated so that we can deliberate on the BIA. Again, it's substantive, not uncommon. Conservative and Liberal governments, as I understand, have put forward quite large BIAs in the past. Ours is quite large as well. It's got lots and lots of measures in it, lots of exciting, meaty things for us to discuss in this committee, and I'm excited to get down to that work. And I would ask members opposite, in good faith, to put their best foot forward, to work with us to do the work that this committee is assigned to do, that in a way we have a duty to do. Madam Chair, I know as the chair of this committee you'll guide us, but it's up to members of Parliament to decide what the agenda looks like. To date, it seems like we've been prioritizing other matters. We've had Conservative and Bloc motions get passed. We've studied and heard from witnesses that they've put forward. I think it's time that the government members have a say in our number one priority here, which is the Budget Implementation Act. And I know that the will of Parliament has, in a way, shown us that there is a majority of members in the House that support this budget. So we really ought to get down to work on this. Canadians, I think, want to see us do that work. So I'll leave it there for now, but as I say, I have lots more to build the case for why I think a BIA should be our next study, and I apologize to the witnesses for treading on some of their time, because I really do value their perspective. I don't always agree with witnesses' perspectives, and I think that's part of what this committee does, right? It has debates, lively debates on various topics. I should be able to ask Mr. Jacques and his team challenging and difficult questions, just as members opposite do all the time with witnesses in this committee. I think that's our duty. So, but I'd say we need to extend that to the BIA, which is going to be a very large undertaking. It's a large bill. It's got lots of positive, from my perspective, very positive things in it. Members opposite won't always see it that way, I understand. But if we don't get down to business on debating those and structuring a study, I wonder how long that's really going to take. And I think we need to ensure that that's top priority. That's really our primary job as members of the Finance Committee. It's to deliberate on budgets and BIAs and government legislation. Government legislation is supposed to take precedence at committee. I know Mr. Kelly will say, well, committees are masters of their own domain, which they are, but I also know that the informal practice of the House is probably a standing order as well that says government legislation is supposed to take priority in terms of the deliberations. But I'm sure that we'll get into more debate about this motion. I hope it'll pass quickly. I know members opposite want to get down to business on the BIA. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. And the member is right. It is a priority of this committee to study government bills when they pass Parliament. The BIA has not passed Parliament. It has been just tabled in Parliament, and the proper order ordinarily is to allow that debate to occur, and then it is referred to a parliamentary committee. That is the motion before the House, to refer it to this committee, and after the vote takes place in the House of Commons, that is when it is referred to this committee. So now, Mr. Turnbull is absolutely right. The committee can decide to do whatever it wants, and that's why, Chair, I strongly encourage you to hold a subcommittee meeting with your vice chairs. That's where the business of committee can be agreed to in an orderly fashion, and so that we don't resort to interrupting the testimony of an officer of Parliament to conduct committee business, which is what this motion is. And so with that, I move that debate on this motion be suspended. Adjourned. I move that we adjourn debate on Mr. Turnbull's motion.
Point of order, Chair.
Point of order, Mr. Turnbull.
I know there's a very specific wording for that dilatory motion, and Mr. Kelly did not say it in the way that it's supposed to be read. So I don't know whether it actually counts as a dilatory motion. Maybe the clerk can check, but I know from my experience on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee that a dilatory motion to adjourn debate has to be word for word what it is in the standing order.
Because Mr. Kelly corrected himself, we'll accept it. So we will now move to a vote on the motion to adjourn debate on this motion.
So on the motion that the debate shall now be adjourned, Mr. Turnbull?
No.
Mr. Litau?
Mouth, no.
So, okay. Mr. Sawatsky? Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Alon?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Ms. Kubina?
Yes.
Mr. Lefebvre?
Oui.
Mr. Garon?
Oui.
5 yeas, 4 nays. The motion carries.
Okay, so the debate on this motion is collapsed. Do we now need to do a vote on the actual motion? No? Okay.
So we're returning.
Okay, so we will return back to Mr. Turnbull, who has about a minute left in his speaking time.
Okay, Madam Chair. Well, I have lots of questions for the interim parliamentary budget officer. I know that you have said that there's less than a 7.5% chance of maintaining the declining deficit to GDP ratio, but does that factor in? I mean, wouldn't that imply that you could predict the growth of GDP in the economy? Like, my understanding is that that assumes that GDP level would stay at what level?
It accounts for the growth of nominal GDP in the economy. That's correct.
So it accounts for the growth, but can you really are you able to predict that effectively?
I would go back to, so we evaluate the forecast accuracy of our economic and fiscal outlook periodically.
Sorry, Mr. Jakes, we're going to have to conclude it there. That concludes that round. We'll continue with Ms. Kobina for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Jacks, the Liberal government projects a decline in deficit to GDP ratio over the next 5 years as a fiscal anchor. In your report, you estimate that there's only a 7.5% chance that the government can actually do that. And I find 7.5% chance is extremely low. Can you explain why there's only a 7.5% chance that this government respects this fiscal anchor that they have set?
So we've used the same kind of methodology that the IMF has used in terms of stress testing this fiscal anchor specifically. And in that, we took into account, as we said, as Mr. Jake said before, the economic shocks that have happened in the past, over the past 30 years. Using those shocks and kind of their impacts on fiscal policy as a result, we determined that there is a 7.5% chance of the deficit to GDP declining every single year over that projection horizon. So we're using a similar methodology that the IMF has used in the past to come up with this conclusion.
There is a 7.5% chance that the government respects their anchors. That in turn means that there's a 92.5% chance that it does not respect the fiscal anchor. Can you comment on that?
Using the stress testing that we've done, you would arrive at that conclusion, but it is a stress test of that fiscal anchor.
Thank you. So Fitch Credit Rating has already warned, of course, that there is pressure on Canada's credit rating because of the close to $80 billion deficit that was presented in the budget, the persistent fiscal expansion, and rising burden of debt. They go on to write that this may be exacerbated by persistent economic underperformance caused by tariff risks and structural changes, including low productivity. Given the challenges related to our fiscal outlook, is this a good time to be introducing more uncertainty and distrust with the vague capital investment definition?
I would say, going back to comments that we offered earlier, more transparency is better than less. It is a significant change in the definition of fiscal anchors that the government wants to use, and having more parliamentary debate and more understanding around what that change means, I think it's beneficial to everyone.
Mr. Jacks, in a recent interview, you actually commented on that, and that the Liberal government ran on the federal debt to GDP ratio as a fiscal anchor, and there was no debate in Parliament over changing it. Is this right? Like, what are your thoughts on this? How does a country just change its fiscal anchor, it's a big deal for Canada? That's how we guide ourselves and make decisions. And how does this Liberal government change it without proper debate or discussion in Parliament? Could you comment on that?
The short answer is the government has full discretion to identify which fiscal anchors it wants to use as part of its management of the economy and the government's finances. A recommendation that we've made is that there should be heightened transparency around that, especially in situations where you have a long-standing and widely respected fiscal anchor, like the declining debt to GDP ratio, used long-standing in Canada, widely used across other jurisdictions, and it's no longer being used as a fiscal anchor by the government. There ends up being risk of potential politicization around the numbers, where there end up being material changes to the fiscal anchors or any other aspects of the fiscal framework without policy discussion around that.
Thank The September 2025 fiscal outlook summary warns that the debt servicing ratio continues to rise over the medium term. At what point would credit rating concerns start pushing Canada's borrowing rates higher in a meaningful way?
That's a question that's better put to a credit rating agency. I'm sure.
Thank you, Ms. Kobina. We're going to have to conclude that round. We're going to continue with Mr. Letao for 5 minutes. Mr. Letao, on vous écoute pas.
Mr. Letao, we can't hear you. Are you on mute? Is your mic connected?
Ça va maintenant?
Can you now hear me? Yes, we can. Thank you. Go ahead. My apologies. After all these years, you would think that I would know how to deal with this. My fault entirely. So, Mr. Jack, let's get back to our discussion from the outset. So just to recap, Canada's financial stability in the midterm is assured, is reliable. I think we established that earlier on. You mentioned that now we have less fiscal room if ever there were to be another shock. Am I correct in summing up what your comment would have been? Yes, that's what I was thinking. Thank you. So, given that, do you think that what we're currently experiencing, and when I say that, what I mean is this, since February 2025, in other words, there's all this uncertainty in terms of trade, international trade. I'm sorry for the noise in the background. Do you feel that would be a shock? Would that be a significant shock to the Canadian economy? Well, I think that would be a part of the definition of shock, the one that I would use. Thank you. Yes, I would too. I think it's a shock. And that's why we've seen the slowdown that we have seen and the fallout of that on, for example, spending and revenue. Now, my colleague, Mr. Turnbull, also raised with you the issue of the deficit to GDP ratio. And your feeling that that probably would not go down given current economic circumstances. In other words, given current forecasts that the government has established and given the various growth measures that are used that the government has established in its budget, you feel that there are significant risks and that we may not be able to achieve these targets or goals. Yes. Thank you. So this is not necessarily an issue of respecting the debt-GDP ratio. It's rather an issue of reaching. Anyway, that's semantics. These are all semantics. I'll carry on. Here's what I would like us to discuss. How would you describe the economic forecasts in the budget? Do you feel that those forecasts and the increase in the ratio are conservative numbers, or do you feel they're rather enthusiastic numbers? How would you characterize the forecasts that are included in the budget? Well, in terms of the economic forecast, those that are used by the Government of Canada, it's reasonable because the government is using the forecast of 14 economists throughout Canada. And that provides some independence when it comes to forecasts like this. And I should also point out that the economic outlook or forecast of the Government of Canada is also aligned with our own. So we're comfortable with those, their forecasts, rather. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, we both agree on that. Now, what wasn't taken into consideration in the budget was a potential stimulative effect of the measures that are being announced. So certain measures were announced. One can like them or not. Whether for example, the actual numbers of the deficit. But what hasn't been included is the potential outcome of these measures. Perhaps those measures will increase growth, perhaps not. We'll see. Thank you, Mr. Leteau. We'll have to wrap up with that, and we'll now continue with Mr. Garon for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Over the past few years, the Trudeau government signed sort of spot agreements in health. There was money that was being transferred to the provinces beyond the Canada Health Transfer. And what this meant was that federal health funding went up by 5.8% per year. Now, these are coming to term now, and from my understanding, my reading of the budget, these aren't being renewed. And because of that, overall health transfers to Quebec and the provinces will be reduced over the next several years. In the budget, the increases were not renewed. Right, so transfers will decrease then. You know, public finances really involve one taxpayer in the end. And when the federal government decides not to increase health transfers in Quebec, what does that mean? That means a taxpayer is paying more or going into debt or services are being cut. So when Mr. Turnbull walks around with his ChatGPT telling us that debt to GDP here is lower than Germany's, when you look at the debts of provinces and you look at the Länder in Germany, what you realize is actually the debt to GDP ratio is actually 10 percentage points higher if you include the provinces. So do you think that is a relevant measure of the state of public finances, given that provinces are the ones responsible for delivering these services? Yes, among other things, it is important to include provinces. Am I right then in saying that when the European Union was created in Maastricht, that Mr. Leteau really likes, there were ceilings that were established with respect to deficit to GDP ratio, as well as debt to GDP ratio. At the time, the overall debt of all the Länders and the states were included. Am I right then in saying that that overall debt was included, and that in Canada, when it doesn't increase health transfers, that might also have an impact on provincial debts and therefore the overall debt? Well, with respect to Maastricht, I agree with what you said. Now, with respect to the impact of transfers from the federal government to the provinces, it really depends on the actions the provinces take. Thank you. We will now continue for 5 minutes with Mr. Lefebvre. Yes. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. For all those viewers listening to us, I would just like to recall that the role of the PBO is to conduct a neutral, nonpartisan analysis. Mr. Jacques, you're the interim parliamentary budget officer. So I would like to take a few moments today to thank you. Thank you for being excellent, doing excellent outreach. Thank you for your competence. You're perfectly bilingual in English and in French. You're extremely credible. You always make yourself available. We've had several meetings with you. And I would say that you're also just a very good person, a nice person. You tick off all the boxes as someone who should fulfill that position. You also have considerable experience. And if ever you decide to put forward your candidacy for the position of PBO, I assure you that I will be supporting your candidacy, and I hope and am persuaded that the colleagues around this table will support your candidacy. So thank you for all the good work that you do. Now, today the Liberals spoke about the potential consequences of American tariffs. Prime Minister Carney yesterday said, who is interested in this? I would like to know if you are interested in this and its impact on the budget. I think that there are very, very important issues that affect the budget, and to hear the Prime Minister of Canada's wonder who is interested in it, I'm concerned. How do you see a comment like that? Well, tariffs are a very important factor when it comes to our outlook. Yes, but to hear what the Prime Minister said in terms of interest in this, are you not concerned to hear him say, well, he's not particularly interested in this? Well, I didn't hear the comments of the Prime Minister. Well, go and take a look on social media, because it's going around. Now, you said you've had trouble in getting information from some departments, that you managed to get it from the Department of Finance, but what departments have you been having more trouble with? Specifically, with respect to our request for information, and the budget and budget 2025, there's been a problem with obtaining information on the cuts that will take place and the 15% reduction in certain departmental budgets, for example, the cutting of positions. We don't have, and we have not received details, and that's why we decided to discuss this and to communicate this to the Speaker of the House, for example, so that we could get help in rectifying this. And were you told when you could get the information that you requested? Any time frame? We are awaiting a ruling from the Speaker of the House of Commons. The Liberal government said that it will balance its operating budget within 3 years. Do you think that's possible? Yes, it's possible, because the Government of Canada has the power to implement some policy changes and to change, for example, make changes to its spending, to its expenditures. So it does have a certain amount of control in order to achieve that operating balance. So you're saying that actually it has to sort of maneuver somewhat, play around with the various budget columns? Well, we sort of did an estimate for the Government of Canada, an estimate of how likely it was to be able to reduce the deficit to GDP ratio, but we did not do the same assessment with the operating balance, because we didn't have enough data to do that. Would you agree that there's sort of been some accounting maneuver, sort of creative accounting, basically, to be able to improve the financial prospects of the country? In terms of the operational balance, there is a mathematical link to the budgeting framework, and I think that the probability. That concludes your time. We'll continue with Mr. Turnbull.
I note that in your previous testimony, in answers to my questions, you had sort of indicated just how important this Finance Committee's role is. And I think, it's shocking to me that the opposition members don't want to study the Budget Implementation Act at this committee, although having previously indicated that your testimony should be included as part of that, which I think is a good thing. We can all agree. I really think that we owe it to Canadians to have these debates, but to do so in the context of government legislation, which is the BIA. So I want to move the following motion, Madam Chair. Given that the committee has already passed a motion to invite the Parliamentary Budget Officer as part of our upcoming consideration of the Budget Implementation Act, and given that the Parliamentary Budget Officer has reasserted that the Budget Implementation Act deserves timely and thorough consideration by this committee, the committee agreed to conduct a pre-study on the Budget Implementation Act and agreed to hold a meeting of the subcommittee agenda and procedure on Wednesday, November 26th to confirm timelines and next steps. So I know that members opposite had indicated in their remarks that we should have a...
Sorry, Mr. Turnbull, there's a point of order.
Oh, okay.
Ma compréhension, Madame la Présidente, c'est que lorsqu'une motion a déjà
From
été
what I understand is once a motion has been tabled and debated and debate has been adjourned on the motion, it can't be brought back. From what I understand, this motion for the main part is not in order. He's doing indirectly what he can't do directly. His initial motion, thank you, Mr. Cowan.
This motion is substantively different because it really calls upon a subcommittee agenda and procedure meeting on this Wednesday, which is the heart of the motion. So although it references the BIA study, it's really
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull.
asking...
Yeah, I understood
Okay.
your, yeah, so same point of order, Mr. Gahan.
Moi, je comprends
Do you
pas
have a
l'anglais.
different point? Do you have a different argument?
Oui, ben, en fait, c'est un
Well,
privilège.
I'm sorry. I don't understand necessarily English. I don't have the motion in both official languages.
I will allow it as it is substantially different enough from the first one. Mr. Kelly?
I don't know if this would call this the same point of order if we're on the order of the question of relevance or
Still on the same, well, I don't know, do you have the same point of order or is it a different point of order?
Well,
that's up to you to decide.
My belief is that his motion is out of order.
Well, I've already determined that I'm accepting it, so thank you,
okay.
Mr. Kelly.
Therefore,
Thank
I move that we adjourn the meeting.
You can't do that on a point of order, Mr.
okay.
Kelly. So, thank you, Mr. Turnbull. You can carry on.
So so we understand that committee members don't seem to want to study the BIA, which is kind of unfortunate given the fact that they want to hear from an important officer of Parliament talking about budget-related matters.
Sorry,
and
Mr. Turnbull.
Fiscal anchors.
There's another. Is it a
Écoutez,
new
Madame
point
la
of
Présidente,
order,
c'est
Mr.
pas
Gahan?
frivole. Nous sommes en train de débattre une motion.
We are debating a motion, and I don't have the text in French.
Is submitted. Thank you. Mr. Turnbull, are you ready? You ready to resume?
Still wanted to motivate the motion.
Yeah, the floor is still yours. Yeah, so.
Thanks, Chair. So it's my understanding that the opposition members don't seem to want to study the BIA. I hope that they certainly don't want to have any debate on studying it. This has come up over and over and over again in our committee, where I've done my very best to this committee has operated in good faith with opposition members having their motions and studies put forward, with the government side agreeing to those within reason. I think this is a very reasonable attempt, a very good faith attempt at studying government legislation, which is the duty of this committee. It is embedded in the this sort of mandate of this committee that the committee members study the BIA, that we prioritize government legislation. This committee has, in many years past, time and time again, done a pre-study on the Budget Implementation Act. There has been very rare occasion where that may not have happened, but very rare. And it is the work and deliberation of this committee to essentially consider the BIA in all of its glory. And there's many pages there to consider. The will of Parliament has been very clear, and it's been expressed by the vote in the House. Numerous votes. Oh, my watch is deciding to talk to me for some reason, trying to interrupt me. I know I've put this forward in numerous ways to try and be productive. This is really just a focus on, can we have a subcommittee meeting to talk about how we can set the agenda for this committee so that we have a schedule leading into the spring. Members opposite suggested that that would be what they wanted in some of their remarks. So this is an attempt to work alongside my colleagues opposite to actually find a path forward to do some pre-study on the BIA. And it's obvious that that they don't seem to want to do that. And I find that shocking and surprising, stupefying even, which is not a word I use often, but I would say it's got me in a place where I'm kind of wondering, why members opposite don't want to actually work to, although they were not willing to go to the polls for an election, but they don't seem to want to do the work that members of Parliament are expected to do on this committee, which is to debate vigorously and work on the Budget Implementation Act. So I'm finding that pretty hard to understand. Maybe members opposite will be able to convince me as to why we shouldn't study the BIA, which is, I don't think they've made many remarks to that effect on the record at all. Actually, they seem to have suggested that they want to study the BIA, but they want to put it off and ensure that we can't do that work, which is kind of shocking when you think about how many investments there are in the budget that relate to their communities, whether it's housing or infrastructure, whether it's mines in Quebec or correcting, small errors, unintentional consequences of a tax cut for 22 million Canadians for those who live with a disability. These are measures that are in the BIA that are going to impact businesses, communities, individuals who are potentially vulnerable at a time like we're experiencing in Canada right now, and they don't seem to want to get down to work on that, which I find a bit shocking and surprising. I would ask them if they can put the partisanship aside and actually work with us effectively to deliberate on the BIA. Again, I think that's the whole point of the Finance Committee. Finance Committee is supposed to do this work, not put it off. And I don't discount that members opposite have other topics and things that they want to study, and I get that. And we've studied some of those topics again in good faith. So I find it there seems to only be an interest in having studies or witnesses that they feel represent a very negative version of reality that they're trying to boost a narrative for, and not really work effectively in good faith with government MPs on this committee to actually do the work that we're tasked to do. It is the mandate of this committee, as I understand it. I probably should do, just get the mandate of the Finance Committee. Do we have a copy of that, Madam Chair, that the clerk could potentially read out? What is the mandate of the Finance Committee? Because I'm pretty sure it includes working on the budget and deliberating on the budget. Could we ask for clarification from the clerk if possible?
They're just checking.
No, I'm not finished yet. You wish? No. I'm invoking the Sims protocol.
The mandate, as part of the mandate of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance established under Standing Order 108 of the Standing Orders of the House of Commons, the committee is empowered to examine and inquire into all matters related to it by the House of Commons, to report from the time to time, and except when the House otherwise orders to send for persons, papers, and records. Like certain other standing committees, the Standing Committee on Finance is also empowered to study and report on all matters relating to the mandate, management, and operation of the department or departments of government that may be assigned to it from time to time by the House. For the Standing Committee on Finance, these departments include the Department of Finance Canada and the Canada Revenue Agency. In addition, commencing on the first sitting day in September of each year, the Standing Committee on Finance is authorized to consider budgetary policy as outlined in Standing Order 83.1. It may also report on proposals regarding the budgetary policy of the government. The committee normally presents its pre-budget report no later than the third sitting day before the last normal sitting day in December, as determined by the calendar set out in Standing Order 28.2.
Appel au règlement,
In
Madame la
each
Présidente.
parliamentary... Yes.
Écoutez, Madame la
Point of
Présidente.
order. Madam Chair, I didn't have the motion in French. Now I have the French version, and I've read it. And obviously, this one has already been debated. Thank you, Mr. Garon. I already ruled on this. I'd call for the vote then, Madam Chair.
Pardon, Monsieur Garon.
Mr. Garon. I'm sorry. It should have been directly right after I ruled, and so it's not in order.
Session, the committee's work may include, I'll get to you after I finish reading this, pre-budget consultations, briefing sessions by departmental officials on federal programs, the examination of planned expenditures of the Department of Finance and the Canada Revenue Agency, a review of order and council appointments, a review of the Bank of Canada's monetary policy reports, a review of Minister of Finance's economic and fiscal updates, consideration of proposed legislation, special studies on topics within the committee's mandate, and consideration of reports of subcommittees. And just before I get to you, Mr. Kelly, I'm just going to thank our witnesses for being here and excuse you. Thank you very much for coming to Finance Committee. Mr. Kelly, point of order.
Mr. Garon was waiting for the French translation and therefore did not have it, so I challenge your ruling that his challenge of the chair was untimely.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, but he had in fact already received it at the time
I'm
because
challenging
it
your
wasn't.
ruling that you ruled that his ruling was
and
not.
I will take a moment. No, it's too late. So thank you very much, Mr. Turnbull. You can carry on with the floor.
Thank you. So as I was saying, what I've I'm just having trouble understanding that you've read the mandate of the committee out. It included many references to the budget, the budgetary process, pre-studies, scrutinizing the economic updates, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a number of aspects of the mandate of the Finance Committee that are uniquely part of this committee, that they don't apply to other committees in Parliament. And, I was on the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and we had some responsibilities that were unique to that committee, which was, unusual compared to some of the other committees. This one is like that as well. It is a central committee, has an important role to play. Members opposite seem to only take that role as necessary and seriously as it deserves when it suits their purpose. In my view, this is the work that this committee is supposed to do, and members opposite don't seem to want to actually play that role. So I know that they all should be operating as good faith members of this committee, but I'm just questioning that at this point because they don't even want to do the essential work that is part of the core mandate of this committee, which is to study government legislation. To do a pre-study on the budget is the practice of this committee. To hear from witnesses, again, they've wrongfully complained that we didn't hear from enough witnesses in the past, expressing a desire to hear from more witnesses on the budget, which was, in my view, sort of misplaced. But at this point, it seems they're not interested at all in hearing from witnesses. So maybe what they want is just to move to clause-by-clause analysis of the BIA. I'm sure at some point or another in the future, they will want to hear from witnesses. So why can't we start that work and have that conversation this Wednesday? Why can't we structure a study that is reasonable, that moves us along to do the work of consideration of the budget? I mean, that is top priority for this committee as far as I'm concerned. So it's just shocking to me that opposition don't want to do that work. I mean, even if I were to take an opposition members and put myself in their shoes, that they don't seem to even want to criticize the government on the budget, which is interesting. Because obviously they're going to have different views and get to present, views on the BIA that, there may be some things they don't agree with. Well, fine. They get the chance and opportunity, just as all of us do, to present their perspectives and express their opinions and dig into the details and deliberate and debate all of those aspects of the BIA. To me, that's operating in good faith. They've got a job to do as we do on this side, and we're trying to do that job. I think I would be, neglecting my duties as the PS to Finance if I didn't push this committee to actually do the work that it was mandated to do. And I will continue to do that, Madam Chair, and continue to remind committee members that the BIA should be a priority for this committee. We should be, embroiled in considerations on it by now. In my view, we should have started this study already, and the Conservatives don't seem to want. You can't hide behind the curtain on this. They hid behind the curtains in the House, although they didn't want to go to a Christmas election. They hid behind the curtains, and now they're trying to hide again, trying to hide from the fact that they don't want to actually work in good faith. They don't even want the opportunity to criticize the government about its BIA. So I find that very disconcerting, to say the least. And I really hope that we can get beyond this impasse and work together effectively to not pass the BIA. Obviously, that'll come in time, but just begin the study on the BIA, hear from witnesses, get into the details of it, have some of those debates. I'm looking forward to that work. I know that it's an extensive study, And I'm sure that, okay. So, yeah, maybe I'll leave it there, Madam Chair. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. I have Mr. McDonald.
Madam Chair, I really don't have anything to add. I think my colleague argued the points well on why we want to pass this motion. So I just encourage my colleagues across the way to give their support, and we can get on with the Budget Implementation Act study.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Mr. Sawatsky?
I cede the floor. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Sawatsky. Mr. Leitao? Mr. Halan?
Thanks, Chair. Just given the fact that Mr. Turnbull tried this once before in the committee without any prior discussion with myself or Mr. Garon, I just thought it would be, it's a normal practice of this committee that if we want to plan any future business, we usually do that in either a subcommittee or the vice chairs usually get together, which now Mr. Turnbull is trying to strong-arm the other members of this committee to do what he wants. So I think that the best route for this is, as we have said before, that, and I would maybe ask you, Chair, to maybe schedule a subcommittee meeting on Wednesday so we can hash all this out and talk about future business. So I'll leave that with you, Chair, and given that, I'd like to move to adjourn the debate.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Halan. We'll now move to a vote on adjourning debate.
So on the motion that the debate be now adjourned, Mr. Turnbull?
No.
Mr. Leitao?
No.
Mr. Sawatsky?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Alon?
Yes.
Miss Goodridge?
Yes.
Miss Kubina?
Yes.
Mr. Lefebvre?
Oui.
Monsieur Simard Tremblay?
C'est Savard Tremblay, mais oui.
Savard Tremblay, désolé, monsieur.
Yeah.
So 5 yeas, 4 nays. The motion carries.
So debate is now adjourned. Mr. Halan?
I just wanted to move to adjourn the meeting.
Meeting adjourned.